Welcome everybody to the Matrix Integrated Solutions Educational Web Series. This topic for today is year-end checklist for Sage 100, and we're going to walk through some ideas and lessons on the best way to close up the books for the year and kind of plan for that coming up in 2022. Can't believe it's 2022 already. Let me see if I can get this PowerPoint to work. So our agenda today is to go through why to run year-end processing in Sage 100, where to run it, kind of getting ready and planning for it, creating some archives and backups of the data so we have some assurances that we don't mess anything up. We've got the order of the modules that we're going to process, and there is a specific order that you should do those in, and then just some FAQs and tips, and then we'll wrap up with some compliance issues and around 1099 and payroll, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Today with me is Dave Scourfield. He's going to be running the overall dialogue and kind of the lessons that we're going to learn today. So Dave, why do you want to run year-end processing? What's the main reason to do this?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we're talking about running the year-end process within the Sage system. So the assumption is that, you know, you've entered all your transactions for the year, you've entered all your adjusting entries, you've printed all your reports, run your financial statements for the period. So you've done everything you need to do to close the books, and now we're just running the year-end process in the system. And that process does really three things. The first thing that it does when you run year-end process is it closes the current accounting period. So each module has what we call a current accounting period. And that really is theoretically the period that you're processing in. So your system today may be in December of 2021. And the reason you'd want to close that current period is to prevent users from posting transactions to that closed period. So you finished your processing for the year, publish your financial statements. You'd want to close that accounting period so that I don't go in and post a transaction to that period because we've already published the financials. So that's the first thing that it does, and the reason we'd want to run period end processing or year-end processing. The second thing it does when you run year-end processing is it actually advances the current accounting period to the next period. So if your system is in December of 2021, you run the year-end process inside of Sage, it's going to automatically advance the current accounting period to the next period, which in my example would be January of 2022. So, and the reason that's important is because a lot of the default lookups and inquiries are based on the current accounting period. So I'm gonna show you this in a minute, but as an example, if you go into account maintenance in General Ledger and you pull up an account and you want to look at the trial balance for that account, or you want to look at the transactional detail for that account, the system will show you the transactions based on the current period that module is in. So if I'm in 2021, in my accounting system in Sage, and I go into account maintenance, I'm going to see transactions for 2021. Now I can look at other fiscal years, but it's going to default to the current period. And so really it becomes an issue of like, you know, user efficiency and ease of use, if you will, so that the users don't have to go in and constantly change what period they're looking at. If you keep that current fiscal period current, that the current accounting period current in the system, then the defaults become much more easy, and the system becomes easier to navigate. And then really the third thing that the year-end process does is it does some data purging and cleanup of the data. And that's really based on history retention settings that you set in the system. So I'll show you this as well, but each module has history retention settings. And based on those history retention settings, when you run the year-end process, it will automatically purge that data for you and do some other data cleanups. And so to me, the reason this is important is it's really going to help the performance of the system. I mean, in the old days when, hard disk space was expensive, part of the reason that the data purge existed was just to save on disk space, right? So today that's really not as much of an issue, but certainly, cleaning up some of that historical data so that the system performs better is valuable. I've worked with customers that have history in their system going back to, literally 15 or 20 years, and that can really slow the performance of the system. So when you go to run a report or you go to do a lookup on, inventory transactions is a good example, and you have a lot of history in your system, that can take minutes to generate a report or do a lookup. And so you do want to purge data on a regular basis so that the system performs better. And, there's a process to do that. So, what I want to do now is just take you into my demo system. You able to see the screen okay then, Jeremy?
I am, yep.
Okay, all right, so this is my demo system. So within each module, you've got this current accounting period. So I'm going to take you into the general ledger, and if we go to the setup task in general ledger and then to general ledger options, you'll see that I've got a current fiscal year and a current period here. So my general ledger is in period 12 of 2021. That's the current period that the system's processing in. If I go down to accounts receivable, I'm going to go to setup, accounts receivable options, show you really the same thing. Accounts receivable module is in period 12 of 2021. So you're going to have a current period and year in every module. And what that's doing for us then is, because my system is now in period 12 of 2021, if I go into the general ledger module and I'm going to post a journal entry, and I try to post this entry into November, it's going to give me that message and it's not going to allow me to post that transaction. So that really is the first reason we want to run the period end, is just to prevent a user from posting a transaction to a closed period. The second thing we were talking about was default lookups in the system. If you remember, my general ledger's in December of 2021. So what that means is when I go into account maintenance and I select an account, I want to look at history on that account, transaction detail on that account. I'm going to select this account and I go over to the history tab, or I go to the transactions tab. You're going to see that the default fiscal year is 2021. I can still, as a user, select a different year and look at transaction history, but by default, that screen comes up as 2021. Similarly, if I go into accounts receivable, I'll just go into another screen. I'll go into customer maintenance, pull up a customer, and I'm going to go over to the history tab. You'll see that that defaults to 2021. Still select other years, but the default becomes 2021. If I go to the summary tab, it's defaulting to period 12 of 2021. So, the reason we want to run the year-end process for 2021 when we're done entering all of our transactions is so that that period advances. And so now as a user, when I come into this screen, rather than having to change this every time to look at 2022, it automatically defaults that information for us. Then the third reason that we talked about running year-end process is this idea of purging data. So if I go into the accounts receivable module, I'm going to go back into accounts receivable options. The history retention settings for most modules will have a history tab. So if you go into the options, which is on the setup menu in all of the modules, so every module will have a setup menu, and then the first task on that menu is options, what we call options. That's where we configure the software. So if I go into accounts receivable options, you're going to see I've got a history tab. And this is where we set those history retention settings that I was talking about. So you can see I've got the system set up to retain 99 years of cash receipts history. I'm keeping 2 years of customer history, 2 years of sales person history. So one thing you might want to do before you run a year-end process is, just check those history retention settings to make sure that they're sufficient for how much history you want to maintain in the system. So if you're in the practice of, looking at your sales history information 5 years back, I would want to make sure that setting is 5 years so that when you run year-end processing, you're not purging data that you would otherwise access through the system. We're going to talk here in a little bit about creating a backup or an archive company. And so, when you run this year-end process, if you do purge information that you didn't need to purge, at least it'll be in the backup company, right? But I would check those history retention settings before you run the year-end process, just to make sure you're retaining the history that you want in the system. So there's a number of different files by module that get purged as part of the year-end process. And Sage publishes a really nice overview document of what happens when you run year-end processing by module. So within the Sage interface, if you go to help, and I'm going to go to help topics, and I'm going to go to index, and then I'm just going to do a search on period end. And you will see a number of documents come up. So you've basically got a period end processing document for each of the modules. And I'm just going to look at the accounts receivable period end processing document to show you what that looks like. Pretty simple, but what's important is this section down here. So this is what happens when you run period end or year end processing in accounts receivable, right? So temporary customers with zero balances, if you've got temporary customers with no balance, they automatically get purged. My 3 settings that I showed you, cash receipts, customer sales history, and salesperson sales history, those all get purged based on year-end processing, based on the settings that you have in your system. Open invoices with zero balances are removed from the open invoice file based on another history retention setting in the system. And so it's real nice if you're wondering, okay, when I run this process, what data actually is going to get purged, just to jump in this help system and do a search for the module that you're going to run and take a look at those files that actually get purged, and then you can make a determination of if you need to potentially extend those out at all. Okay, so that's what I wanted to show you in the system. If you want to take the presentation back, Jeremy.
Yeah, you're seeing my screen?
I am.
All right, great. So let's go to the next question. Can you talk about where to run that process within Sage? You certainly talked about where they can find data out about what it does, but can you talk about where it's happening that they would close processing for the year?
Yeah. And this is actually very simple. We're talking about year-end processing because we're at the end of the year, right? But really, year-end processing gets run from the period end task on the period end menu within each module. So you're probably already doing this, right? You may be doing this. You're running a period end process at the end of every month. Okay. What happens is when you run the period end process and you're in the last period of your fiscal year, the system detects that. It knows that my system is in period 12 of 2021. When I run period end process, it will automatically then run the year end processing for that module. So it just sort of happens automatically. You don't have to do anything special. You would just run your period end process and it'll automatically trigger for you. The other thing I wanted to mention, you can jump to that next bullet. Yeah. Period end processing or year end processing, it is required in most of the modules, although there are a few modules that will not have a period end option. And when we're talking about modules, I'm talking primarily of the transactional modules. So general ledger, accounts receivable, accounts payable, sales order, the modules where you process transactions. There's obviously no period end process in like the productivity modules, your custom office module, your library master module, your paperless office module. They're not transactional. So you won't have a period end process to run in those modules, but the transactional modules you will, with the exception of, there are 4 modules that don't have a period end process. If you're using bill of material or work order, which are the manufacturing modules, there are no period end or year end processes in those modules. RMA, which is return merchandise authorization, that module does not have a period end task. And then the bank rec does not have a period end task. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, because they are transactional modules, but those 4 modules, you won't have a period end process to run.
Got it. So when we look at planning for this year-end process, what are some major aspects of life we should think about?
Yeah, kind of the big things when it comes to actually running the year-end process in Sage, right, is the books should be closed. I mean, this is kind of obvious, but just to reiterate that, what we're talking about today is the process of closing the year in the system, certainly not all of the reconciliation and transaction work that you do to reconcile your general ledger and publish a financial statement. So, the first thing is you wouldn't want to run this until the books are closed, until you've entered all your, adjusting entries for the year and you've run your financial statements and, that's kind of all wrapped up. And so this almost just becomes a system maintenance formality issue, if you will. So books should be closed when you run this process. And then the other thing that I would mention is you want to, and you probably already know this because you're running period end, but it needs to be run or scheduled to be run off hours. Can't do it in the middle of the day while users are in the system transacting. And really all the batches that users process need to be updated. So, you want to schedule it, which, I wish we had a different answer on that. It needs to be done off hours, but that is the answer. You need to do it when other users are not in the system, and you do want to make sure that all the user. I have several customers that leave transactional batches over the course of an evening or over the course of a week or whatever for different reasons. And so you really, when you go to run your period end or your year end, you really want to make sure that all those batches are updated, because it will stop you from running the year end or period end process if you've got open batches. And there's nothing worse than scheduling to stay after hours to run the year end and then not be able to do it because you've got open batches. So just make sure that you get all the batches updated and then you do it off hours. The good news is the process itself, I mean, it probably takes 5 minutes or less. This is not a lengthy process in terms of system time to run. I was actually working with a customer a couple of weeks ago that had not run period ends for a number of years, and we were closing one module, and they wanted to do it in the middle of the day. They wanted to bounce all users out over their lunch hour and just get it caught up. Because she was available that day and wanted to get it done. Well, because it hadn't been running so long, we were able to close one period for them, and it did take about 45 minutes. Now that's unusual because it hadn't been done for so long. So this is system maintenance. If you stay up on it, that process is probably going to take literally 5-10 minutes or less. But if you're behind in your period closings, then that could take more time, because what it's doing is it's going through and purging data, and it needs to look at every record to determine whether it's a record that needs to be purged. So, but if you stay on top of it, it'll actually be a pretty quick process to run. So, okay.
So when we look at the kind of the safety measure, there's more than one reason to create an archive or a backup, but certainly kind of just making sure that things aren't going to blow up on us is a good thing to do. But can you talk about, the validity of running an archive and backup, as well as where to do that?
Yeah. So we always recommend before you run a year-end process in the system that you do create an archive or a backup company. And really the reason is twofold. Because we are doing data purge and data cleanup, if we were to purge data that you didn't mean to purge, then we've captured it in a backup company. Now, most of you are backing up your systems by other means. I expect you have some kind of nightly backup that your IT vendor, is responsible for, which is nice. But this gives us a way to create a company backup in the Sage interface. You'll have access to it immediately. We can get to it without having to contact your IT vendor and have them reload the database or anything like that. And so we always recommend that you run an archive or backup company before you run the year-end process. And really the whole process, I'm going to show you how to do that here, but it really doesn't take much time to do that. The other thing that we'll use backup companies for, just as an aside, is I would imagine a number of you have testing companies. So maybe we've created them or you've created them, companies to do testing. If you want to try out a transaction in the system, see how it's going to post, make a configuration change and post it, potentially without having to do that in your production database. We've created a test company for you. So really, the task that we use to create those test companies is the same task that I'm going to show you today to create a backup company. So it's a good way to create a test company if you haven't done that. But certainly you'll want to do this before you run the year-end process. The task itself is in library master company maintenance, and I'm going to go ahead and take control of the screen, Jeremy. All right, excellent. So back into the demo system, creating a backup company before we run the year-end process. So that task is done within the library master on the main menu within company maintenance. So if I go into company maintenance, these are all of the companies that are in my Sage instance. And the company that I'm working in today is the ABC company. You can see I've got a number of other companies here that are demo and testing companies. So to create a backup or an archive of that ABC company, the first thing we have to do is create a new company code and create that database, if you will, in the system. Company code is a 3-digit code. It can be alphanumeric, anything you want it to be. I'm going to just call my company code B21 because it's the backup of ABC for 2021 year end. So that's the company name. The company code is B21. So I've created that now. There it is, but it really doesn't have any data in it. So the first step is create the company code. Once I do, then I select that company code. And now I've got this copy button available to me. So what I do is I click on copy. It's going to give me this little warning message. The system gives you the capability of creating copies of just some of the modules. So you could do just like accounts receivable and accounts payable and skip the general ledger as an example. You really don't want to do that, but that's the reason it's giving you this message is you've got integrated modules. You might want to not do partial copy because of the integration between the modules. So it's just giving you a little warning message there. You can bypass that. And then what it's going to do is it's going to ask me for the source company. So this is very important. And if you do this, if you enter in the right way, it's fine. But the source company then is the company I'm copying from. The destination company is the company I'm copying to. So I'm copying from ABC, which is my production company. I'm copying into B21, which is my backup company. And that will kind of automatically happen for you. If it went in company maintenance, you're in the company that you want to copy to. I've actually had a couple customers that have done this. You want to be careful doing it the wrong way, because if I were in ABC when I did the copy, and then I selected B21 as that would be the source company, then I'd actually be copying my test or backup company over top of my production company, right? So just be careful on that. You want to go into the company that you want to copy to, and then select as your source company the company you're going to copy from, and then it's going to automatically check all of the modules. So it's, by default, it's saying, yeah, I want to do a copy of the data for all the modules in my system. Click on proceed. Do you want to copy all data files for the selected or to the selected company? I just answer yes. Now this will happen very quickly on my system because it's a demo system. I don't have a ton of data in the system, but really in real life, that process probably will take 5 to 10 minutes or less. And here again, it's dependent on the amount of history that you retain in your system, amount of transactional activity. But it's not a lengthy process. I've done some very large systems before that, 10 minutes max to do that. And so not a big process to run that. A couple other things that I want to point out about creating backup companies, or you can use this same tool for creating test companies too. We talked a little bit about that. The forms do not copy over. So if you have like a custom invoice form with your logo on it, which I assume most of you do, or you have a check form that's formatted to print on your pre-printed forms, whatever, custom forms will not copy as part of this copy process. There's a separate process to do that. Now, when we're talking about creating a backup for year-end purposes, that's probably not that important because it's not like you're going to use that company to process transactions. You're just using it as a historical reference. So probably not that important that the forms don't copy. But if you use that company copy to create a test company, and then you want to test some transactions, and you want to print on your forms, we would need to move the forms, and that's a separate process. It's a little more involved, so I'm not going to show you how to do that today, but if it's something that you want to learn how to do, just let us know. We'd be glad to help you out with that. The other thing I wanted to mention about company copies is if you've got company specific security set up, so you've got multiple companies in your system and you've got users that have access to certain companies and not others, you would need to grant them access, obviously, to this new company if you wanted to allow them to go into the new company. So, you've got to give access to any new company that you create, otherwise you won't be able to get into it. So, I mean, that just makes sense, but I wanted to mention it. A lot of our customers, rather than doing company specific security, they've just granted access. There's a setting in user maintenance to grant access to all companies. If you've done that, then it's not an issue. Any company you create, everybody would have the same access to that they currently have for the existing companies. So, but those two things I wanted to point out to you. So,
Dave, is there any limitation to the number of companies that are in the system, or is that unlimited? Or
yeah, it's a good question. No, there is no limit. I mean, it's literally limited. Well, we could do the limitation if we could figure out, alphanumeric 3-digit code, right? Whatever the permutation is on that, but it's virtually unlimited just based on disk space. I mean, I have customers that. I've got a customer that has, I think, 80 different companies, and some of those are test companies and backup companies. And you'll see that if you're creating backups every year before you run year-end process, you may have, 10 or so backup companies already in your system. So yeah, good question. There really is no limitation to that.
All right. So I know this is a question always was burning in my mind doing this process for myself, was the order process that it has to happen. So we talked about the modules, and then there's some of the modules that don't need flows, but what's the best order? Is there logic to this order, or is it just kind of something we need to make sure we jot down?
No, that's a good question. There is some logic to it. Sage published what you're looking at, which is the official order to, well, let me start with this and say, each module other than the 4 that I mentioned have a year-end or period-end process to run. So, and they all need to be run separately. So you have to run them one at a time. They don't all run at the same time. So they need to be run separately. Sage published this document as their preferred order to close them in. The reality of it is, and what I tell my customers is to simplify this, just close from the bottom of the launcher to the top of the launcher. So you can see like they're recommending purchase order, sales order, inventory happen before general ledger. Well, I'm going to take control back here, Jeremy, just so I can show this. If we look at my launcher.
Yeah, your screen's on.
Yes. Can you see it?
Yep. Yep. I can see it.
All right, cool. Thank you. So if you look at my launcher, purchase order, sales order, inventory are at the bottom and general ledger's at the top. So I think the easiest way to do it is just close from the bottom of the launcher to the top. And the logic to this is, your transactional or your subsidiary modules, if you will, down at the bottom here, post to modules further up the tree. So as an example, the sales order module, if you create an invoice in sales order, it will post the inventory effects of that to the inventory module, and the invoice will post to the accounts receivable module, and the general ledger posting will post all the way up to the general ledger. And so they really want you to close the modules first that post modules further up the tree, because what you could do is you could have like a sales order invoice batch with a November transaction in it. And if you've already closed your accounts receivable module for that period, it won't allow it to post to accounts receivable because that period's already closed. So really the logic of it is any module that would post to another module that gets closed first. And so if you look at the launcher, just work your way up the launcher. And that's to me is the easiest way to approach it, with the general ledger module obviously always being the last module to close, because any module can and does post up to the general ledger module. So that should be the last module that you close.
Anything more to share to show on that screen?
No, I think we're good.
I will take back.
Yeah, you know what? Let me do this. Did you take it back?
I did, but you can take it back if you need to.
Actually, I think now would be a good time to just go through and run the process. All right. Okay. So we've gotten to the point where we can actually just run the year-end process. And I just want to show you how that's done. So like we said, within each module, I'm going to go to the accounts receivable module. Within each module, you've got a period end menu. And you'll see, one thing I did want to point out is you'll see like within period end in accounts receivable, there are a number of other tasks like finance charges and statement printing and commissions. These, because you're closing the books, you should have already done these tasks. What they try to do is group tasks that would be part of your closing process on the period end menu, sort of so it's logical. Hey, these are some other things that I should be doing that process transactions in the system that are part of my close process. So there will be some other things on the period end menu, but the process itself gets run under the period end processing task. So if I go into accounts receivable, period end process, one other thing I want to mention here is I'm going to deselect print period end reports. The period end reports are literally nothing more than reports that are on the report tree. Okay, so within accounts receivable, a number of these reports are considered period end reports, like the accounts receivable aging, right? Well, normally you would have already printed those reports as part of your closing process, since you would already have your month-end reports that you print in your closing package. And so I'm not a big fan of waiting until I run the period end process in Sage to print those reports. Those should have already been run. There are no special reports that they list here that aren't on the reporting tree in Sage. And so kind of once you go through your month-end checklist of the reports that you need to close the books, you're done. And when you get to actually running then the year-end or period end process in Sage, you can just deselect this and it won't generate any reports for you. So other than that, it's pretty simple. It's just going to come up and tell me I'm closing accounts receivable for the period as well as the year. So it's detected that I'm in the last period of calendar 2021. So it's telling me that I'm going to do both period and year-end processing. I click on proceed. It's going to give me one more opportunity to say no. And it's going to tell me that period 12 ending 12/31/2021 is going to be changed. And that's something we talked about earlier. It's automatically going to change the current period from period 12 to period 1 of 2022. So automatically will do that for us. Do you want to complete the year-end processing? I say yes, it's done. I mean, it literally took that long. Now here again, this demo database, your system might take a minute or two, but it shouldn't take much longer than that. So that's done. And go up into general ledger just to walk you through that again. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, but we go down to period end processing. I'm not printing the period end reports. I proceed. This is an additional warning you get in general ledger. We have the ability to create month end or year end allocations in the general ledger. It's just telling me that I haven't run the allocations for year end. So if you have allocations here again, you probably would have already run these. If you don't, it's just giving you a warning that you haven't run them. So do you wish to continue with period end processing without posting? I'm going to say yes. It's going to give me the same recap. It's going to advance the period and we're done. And so now if I go back into accounts receivable options, you'll see it's advanced the period to January of 2022. And what's nice about that is when I go into customer maintenance and I select the customer, now that summary tab is automatically advanced to January of 2022. Go to the history, I'm in 2022. Notice I can still get back to 2021. There's my 2021 activity. But by default, it's going to take the user to 2022 as a time saver there. So that is the process of actually running that period end or year end process. So, okay, Jeremy, take that back.
It might be a stupid question, but the period that designates the year end is defined by the general ledger fiscal calendar year. Is that correct?
Actually, that's a great question. Yeah, no, that is a good question. Yes, yeah, that is true. Within the general ledger module on the setup menu, we're still viewing my screen, correct?
We are.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so within general ledger on the setup menu, you have fiscal year maintenance. And if I go in there, you can see now because I've closed the general ledger for 2021, it's telling me that 2022 is the current year. But yeah, this is the fiscal calendar that you define. There's my 2021. It's now considered a prior year. And yeah, so I've been saying all along, when you get to December or period 12, Sage can accommodate up to 13 fiscal periods within a year. And they don't have to be calendar, obviously. So we have customers that are on 445s, we have customers that are on fiscals. And so you define the fiscal calendar in fiscal year maintenance. And when you get to whatever that last period is in the fiscal year, that's when it knows that it also needs to run year-end process. So yeah, it's a good question.
All right. You say I have one good question.
Keep them coming.
So let's talk about, go back to, we were talking about the module closures, the last piece of the puzzle. So year-end tips, any tips that you can give us for this process that are kind of unique?
Yeah, just a couple things, I guess. I think we've talked about them, one of them anyhow. Is specifically with the general ledger. I mean, here we are at we're going to be at the end of December, probably within the first week or two of January, you will have processed everything that you're going to process in the subsidiary modules, in accounts receivable and accounts payable. So you could run the year-end process for those modules and leave, because the process is done in each module. You could leave the general ledger module open, and you probably would, right? You're waiting on year-end adjustments, waiting on the accountants to come back with whatever their tax or audit adjustments are. And so it's not unusual that the general ledger would stay open for a number of periods beyond closing the other module. My recommendation is always to close all of the subsidiary modules at the same time. They give you the ability to leave some open and close others, but unless there's a real reason to do that, my recommendation is to close all the subsidiary modules at the same time, and that normally would happen within the first, whatever that is, 10 to, I don't know. I have customers that do it in 2 business days. I have customers that, maybe it's two weeks, but within the first couple of weeks of that next period to run that process, but then leave the general ledger open while you're waiting on those final adjustments. And that's not going to prevent you then from running any reports. So if you were to leave the general ledger open in 2021 while you're processing in January of 2022, to the end of January, you'll have the ability to run a full financial statement, balance sheet, and income statement for January of 2022 while your December 2021 general ledger is still open. So, it's flexible enough that, you can still process in that next period and continue to report in that next period, and it's not going to be a problem. The other note then regards payroll. If you use payroll, and this is obvious as well, but payroll is calendar and Sage can be fiscal. So with payroll, there's a quarter end process that gets run, and that will always be based on calendar quarters: March, June, September, and December. And if your company happens to be on a fiscal period, then those periods function based on the fiscal calendar in the general ledger module. So even though maybe you're not closing out the year end because you're on a fiscal, you'd still need to do it for the payroll module.
So Dave, since this is really a kind of continuation of period end processing, the year end just follows the fiscal year.
Yep.
If I remember right, if you close the AR module, that moves the period to the next period, so 1 to 2. Mm-hmm. And if you're posting if you haven't closed it, transactions are going into what they call the next period for that rollover. So I think the fear is always waiting a whole extra month or a whole extra period, because your buckets might be kind of messy if you don't do that process. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually glad you asked that. Seriously, because you hadn't asked me that before, if you've been on Sage for a long time, you'll remember you'll remember what Jeremy's talking about, is that there was a limitation. And so you would want to close your detail module, before you got to what we call the second future. So basically, in my example, once you were going to start processing February 2022 transactions, you would want to make sure you had December closed, or otherwise we had a bucketing system and everything got messed up. When they rewrote Sage in the 4X framework, they eliminated all of those future period buckets. And so all of that's gone, really. And it's the good and the bad of it, right? I mean, it's nice now that there is no requirement to close the period for fear that you're going to mess up some of the reporting. But the bad is then you just don't close the periods, right? And so we have customers that aren't in the normal practice of closing the periods because they have eliminated that as a constraint. So yeah, they kind of did away with, and it's happened over time. But if you're on a current version today, we don't have any of those kind of next period buckets anymore. You can literally, as long as you're retaining the history, you can report on any prior period.
Got it. All right, good to know that that's been rectified. All right, so some FAQs that are pretty common. One is, can I print a financial statement for the next fiscal year prior to performing year-end processing?
Yeah. So we kind of touched on that on the last slide. If you do not run your year-end process for 2021 in the general ledger module, and you get out into January, February, and March, which is going to be typical while you're waiting on those final adjustments, then yeah, you can, you can continue to run financial statements for those future periods while the general ledger is still open.
After year-end processing, can I delete accounts and still do a comparison statement?
Yeah, so if you're maintaining general ledger history, meaning you want to report on that history, then you can't really delete the accounts. So, as an example, if I've got 5 years of general ledger history in my system and I want to delete an account that I haven't used in 5 years, but it did have a balance 5 years ago, the system's not going to allow you to delete it because it's got history attached to it, right? The workaround on that really is, which makes sense, so we can't, because otherwise you'd then print a trial balance out that wouldn't be in balance. And so, do I have the right question? Yeah, okay. Sorry, I lost track there for a second. So, but what you can do is you can now in the newer versions mark accounts as inactive. So there's now a status in account maintenance where you can set an account to inactive. And then what that does is that prevents a user from posting to it. So if you have an old account that has history in it that you need for comparative financial reporting purposes, but you don't want to allow users to post to it, just flag it, set it as inactive, and it will then prevent a user from posting to that account.
So once the history is purged, ultimately we can. If we're keeping history for 5 years, and the 6th year we can delete that account.
That's correct. That's correct.
But until then, we're out. Got it. Can I process year-end in general ledger before I finish off the other modules?
Yeah, and we kind of talked about that as well. The answer on that is no. General ledger will be the last module that you close, and that's because any other module can post to that. So that'll be the last one that you would run year-end process on or period-end process on.
All right. And the last one, can I open an old closed fiscal period in the general ledger for posting of adjustments?
Yes, the answer to that is yes. I'm going to show you how to do that. It's actually very simple. So if you get through your year-end process and for whatever reason you closed it and you forgot to book an entry, it's actually very simple to fix that. Take control of the screen.
Your screen is showing.
All right. So I have closed my general ledger through December of 2021. I forgot to book an adjusting entry. All I need to do is go back into general ledger options and change the current fiscal year right through the interface, change the current fiscal year to period 12 of 2021. So I'm resetting it manually. I then will be able to go into general journal entry and book my entry. And I'm going to book this as of 12/31/21. And to adjust cash, whatever it is, I'll make my journal entry. That makes no sense, but you get the idea. It'll allow me to post that into 2021.
Some people are cringing right now with that entry.
As I said, it makes no sense. Oh, you mean to adjust cash or just the fact that it went to prepaid expense or whatever? All right. So now that's been adjusted, or that's been posted. So once we post the adjusting entry to the period that I reopened, all I have to do then at that point is go back into general ledger options and change it back to period 1 of 2022. So the thing you do not do, we used to have to do this because of some of what Jeremy was referencing with these buckets and stuff. We don't have to do that anymore. You literally can just go in, change the period, book your entry, and then change it back to what it was. That entry will be posted in the correct period in your general ledger, and your financial statements will be fine. And so it's a very simple process to do.
All right. think we're about coming to the end. Let's get through these questions. So compliance, there's definitely some things to take into account for payroll and 1099s through AP. Can you talk to the compliance and versioning? This is a busy slide, but I think the overall gist is around payroll and
I can get us through it pretty quickly. If you're a payroll user and you use the payroll system to print forms, 941s or W-2s, we will be getting, matter of fact, we already have received from Sage a year-end update so that you can print 941s and W-2s. Apparently there was some change with the 941 that happened kind of late in the year. So the good news on that is Sue, whom most of you probably know if you use payroll and does a lot of our payroll for us, she's already in the process of reaching out to all of our payroll customers to schedule the upgrade. We're going to take care of that. We've got a list, and if you haven't heard from her, you should be hearing from her. But the thing to know is there is going to be a year-end update that has to be applied to your system. Regarding 1099s, if you do use Sage to print 1099s out of Sage, there will be, well, there are requirements in terms of the version that you need to be on to run the 1099s. Last year, IRS came out with a new 1099 NEC form, and that caused a bunch of changes in the software. And because of that, the only versions of Sage that are officially supported for 1099 printing are listed there: 2019.5, 2020.4, and 2021.2. So you need to be on one of those major versions, 19, 20, or 21, with the service update that's listed next to it to print 1099s out of Sage. And then with the addition, or in addition to that, if you're on 2019.5, there's also going to be a year-end IRD that we have not received yet. And so, and then there will be an Atrix update that's part of that. Atrix is actually the third-party software that integrates into Sage that generates the forms. It's actually the tool that we use to print the W-2s, 941s, and 1099s. And there's going to be a year-end update on that. So all to say, if we don't have as good a visibility of customers that use the system to print 1099s, but if you do use Sage to print 1099s, let us know if you need help with, you'd want to check your version and let us know if you need any help in getting, up to the compliance service update that you need to be on to print those 1099s.
Dave, can you tell everyone how to find out what version they're on?
Yeah. If you, within Sage, within your launcher, if you just go to, you want me to show that real quick, Jeremy? I can take the screen back another second. Okay. Real simple to do in the new version. Back in my, all right, back in my Sage launcher, if I just go to Help, Sage, About, this screen will come up. So this tells me that I'm in version 2020.1, that's the service update. And I'm running payroll version 2.20.3. So that should display for you, and then you can do a quick check to see what version you're in. Okay.
All right. We're about ready to wrap up. So I guess back to, and just so everyone knows, this has been recorded, so you can come back to that slide, or if you need that slide to make sure that you're on the right compliance, let us know, and we'll kick that over to you in an email. All right, so next up is our next upcoming session is on warehouse mobility. We're going to have a special guest of ScanForce present their solution for PO receiving, SO picking, and physical count on a mobile device in the warehouse. So just be aware that's coming up on the 13th. We're going to take a little break between now and the holidays. So 13th of January is our next session. And from there, I'm going to open it up for questions. You can ask a question in the chat window. I'll unlock your mics and allow everyone to speak if that makes sense. We'll hang out for a few minutes if anyone does have a question. And then if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can email myself or Dave or give us a call either way. With that being said, I'm going to open up mics. If I can figure out how to do that.
This technology is a challenge, huh?
Exactly. Come off that.
Glad you got it figured out.
All right, so you'll have to unmute your mic to speak, but let me know if you have any questions and we'll hang out for a second. Great information, Dave. I think as it comes up for the end of the year, it's always, we only do it, maybe people are keeping up on the 12-month fiscal period end close, but sometimes that year end eludes them.
Yeah, and it becomes a bigger deal simply because I'm getting some feedback. It becomes it's a bigger issue at year end because of the history, the data purge that it does, you know. So that's why it's, you know, period end's a little different in that it doesn't do the same amount of data purge that you get with the year end process. So.
Any questions out there? I don't see anything in the chat, and I don't see anything.
I have a question. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can, yeah, Margaret. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing
Quick question. Can you run a trial balance specifically with just active GL accounts?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm going to look right now that I answered that. But if I think on the trial balance window, when you go in there, I'm looking right now to see what version are, and I'm trying to remember.
You know, unfortunately, I don't have it open. Let me.
Okay, we might have to do
Let me open it up. I think about it one time a year when I dump the numbers for our auditors, and I'd like to get the inactive out, and so it's timely conversation. And you could give me a call, Dave.
Yeah, okay, we could definitely. You know what I'm thinking about? I'm looking now in my 2020, which is fairly current, and there is no inactive. That's the status. It's called the account status, and that is not a
Right
on that.
Okay.
A number of the other reports do have it. That's odd that it's not there. But you know what, Margaret? It's such an easy. I mean, it's a 5-minute change. If you need us to do that, I mean, I can jump on and take care of that. Real simple.
Yeah, that would be great.
And you want to just
great because I end up just dumping it into Excel, and then I have all these 0 accounts that are inactive. That
okay.
Yeah, that was perfect.
So simple to do. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions?
Going once, going twice. We'll throw that last slide up again. Don't hesitate to call us, email us. We're here to answer any of those questions. So just let us know.
Thank you, everyone.